All right. Hopefully you guys can hear me. We're here live. Just to get started here, I hope we didn't give you a bait and switch. You're stuck with me. My name's Lance Egan. I'm an Umpqua fly, signature fly designer, they call us these days. And I'm sitting in, pinch hitting, if you will, for the legend, the man, Pat Dorsey. He really wishes he could be here. I assure you of that. He's feeling a little under the weather and didn't feel well enough to host this little session. So I apologize for that because Pat is an absolute expert at tailwaters. I will try my best to get you the information that you want to hear. Hopefully, Pat will get an opportunity to do another tying session on tailwaters down the road because he is definitely a master of the tailwater. But moving on, we wish Pat well, and we want to get down to business here and chat about some tying goodies. So again, my name is Lance Egan. I work for Fly Fish Food in Orem, Utah, and I'm a part-time fly fishing guide, a longtime member of Fly Fishing Team USA. I love to fish just like all of you do, and look forward today or tonight really to sharing a bit about tailwater fishing. So let's see. Before we really get going here, we need to set out a couple of thanks. So number one, on behalf of all the tyers in this video and all the Umpqua tyers, I want to thank Umpqua for the opportunity we have to share our patterns with the audience here on these tying sessions. So thanks all of the Umpqua family. And then a big shout out to Trout Unlimited for helping promote these and helping us get these tying sessions going. I think that you'll enjoy them. One other thing real quick, there are lots of these already on YouTube, some from last season, and also there are some from this season that are already uploaded on YouTube. So if you've missed some, you can go to the Umpqua Feather Merchants YouTube channel and see some of those past episodes. And then one last thing, just a heads up, these tying sessions go through March, and they're basically every Thursday through March. So keep an eye out. You'll see reminders on the social media channels of Umpqua and often of the tyers featured in them for the upcoming events. I think next week we have some saltwater flies, so that'll be really cool. Don't forget to like and subscribe. If you subscribe to the channel, you'll get notifications every time one of these videos populates, so you'll be first to know if you missed it live. So don't forget to like and subscribe. That'll get you all the cool information when you get cool guys like Pat Dorsey on here. Anyway, tonight we have the topic of tailwaters. So tailwaters, and by the way, as I'm going here, we have live questions. So we're going to break here and there for some tying, some fly tying, but we'll have sections between the flies where we can do a little Q&A. So if you have specific questions, I probably won't have all the answers, but I will do my best to answer as many questions as possible. So if you have questions, send them through. I think we're taking questions both on YouTube and on Instagram. If you're watching on Instagram, that's cool, but unless you're stuck only on your phone, I suggest getting on YouTube because you can make the screen bigger, maybe on your laptop or a computer. You'll be able to see the flies a little better. But if Instagram's the only way to watch, that's perfect too. So again, we're talking about tailwaters. With that in mind, let's just, before we get into tying flies, let's talk a little bit about what a tailwater is. So in a nutshell, a tailwater fishery is a river that comes out of a dam versus the opposite of that would be, say, a spring creek that just bubbles up out of the ground, thus the spring, or a freestone that is basically snow melt. Tailwaters are designated by having a reservoir above them, and they have specific things that happen in a river, changes, if you will, that happen in a river because of that reservoir. And there are lots of things there, lots of differences, freestone, spring creek, tailwater, if you will, because of that reservoir. And they're not all exactly the same, but they do have lots of things that tend to be consistent throughout most tailwaters. So let's see. Chatting about tailwaters. So number one, they come out of a dam, right? That's what is a tailwater. So from there, we have all kinds of things that come into play. So tailwaters experience less extreme flows, less extreme highs and extreme lows. Because we generally have controlled flows coming out of a dam, you don't have the peak runoff that a freestone might see, and the super low flows in extreme drought or in the middle of winter time sometimes that freestones would see. Tailwaters tend to fish more like a spring creek than they do a freestone, except that they still have more fluctuations, just not the extreme fluctuations that you see in a in a freestone environment. So a spring creek tends to be almost always the same, with very rare exceptions. The exception might be in a flood, rain flood event, but generally speaking, spring creek bubbles up out of the ground all the time at the same volume of water. And a tailwater, we still have spring flows that come up a little bit and winter flows that go down a bit, but you don't have, on my local closest tailwater here, the Provo River, in wintertime, it usually runs at 100, 150 cubic feet per second. In the summer, maybe on the low end of things, 350. Most of the time, it's 400 to 600 or 700 cubic feet per second. And in extreme highs, we might see it at 2,000, something like that, where the freestone sections of the Provo sometimes will get to 5,000 cubic feet per second. So the tailwater sections just don't experience those super high flows. And on the low end of things, the freestone stretches of the Provo will get into I've seen it down to like 30 cubic feet per second. And the tailwater sections don't get that low. So that's kind of a neat thing. As far as the fish are concerned, it helps keep plenty of water in the river, and it also affects temperature. Many reservoirs or tailwater fisheries are because they're deep. They have cold flows that come out of them, and there are various types of reservoirs. Most of them are probably bottom draw, where they're always cold water coming off the bottom of the dam. But there are some fisheries, some reservoirs that have kind of almost like an elevator shaft, if you will, that can take water at any level in the reservoir. So they have an outlet structure that can manipulate the depth where the water comes out of the lake, which then they can also manipulate temperature. Usually the deeper they go, the colder it gets, and the higher they go, the warmer it gets in the summertime. And in the wintertime, the opposite of that might be true. Deeper you get, it might be a degree or two warmer, and near the surface might even be a little bit colder. So we don't experience those temperature extremes on tailwater, So that's a nice thing. But it also has some effects on the fish, and it has some effects on the invertebrates, or the bugs, if you will, that live in those rivers. So tailwater fisheries tend to have mostly small insects. That's not to say that they won't ever have large bugs, because you could have a tailwater fishery that still has big stoneflies and things like that. But tailwater fisheries, generally speaking, whether you're fishing them in Colorado, in Montana, in Idaho, in Utah, in the Northeast, or in Europe, or wherever, tailwater fisheries tend to have fish that concentrate on the most prevalent food forms, which tend to be very small. So midges are very popular, very small baetis, crustaceans such as scuds or sow bugs. There's all kinds of small invertebrates that can be very, very popular and very dense in tailwater fisheries. Again, these are kind of generalizations, so this isn't going to be true for every single tailwater fishery, but generally speaking, these are going to be truths. So again, we have cold controlled flows. So in the summertime, when it's really, really hot out, a tailwater fishery can still be fishing really, really well, because the water temperature might still be in the 40s or maybe the low 50s. Versus on the flip side of that, in the wintertime, a tailwater often fishes much better than a freestone, because the water is warmer. Coming out of the dam, again, locally here, a lot of our rivers release from the reservoir at like 38, 39, 40 degrees, somewhere in there, where a lot of the freestones will have ice almost covering most of the river. They're almost not fishable. And the tailwater fisheries remain open all through the winter, generally speaking again. What else? Tailwaters have very clear flows oftentimes. When you have a deep reservoir, you have the opportunity for sediment and particles in the reservoir to settle. And so what oftentimes comes out of a reservoir, again, not always, but most of the time, tailwater fisheries can be very clear. That can present a problem as far as spooky fish, selective fish, and so on. It's a fun problem to have, I think, because it offers a challenge to us anglers, but sometimes it's not fun when you can see lots of fish and you can't catch them. In clear water, fish tend to be spooky and hard to catch. With that in mind, a couple of tips to fish tailwaters. Number one, be stealthy. In clear water, you don't want to make a lot of noise while you're waiting. You don't want to wear bright colored clothing, something that in clear water a fish could see you from far away. I don't think you have to necessarily be wearing camouflage, but you should probably be wearing drab colors, olives, tans, grays, things like that, blending in with your environment rather than you don't want your fluorescent orange hunting vest on while you're out trying to catch a fish. Wear a gray hat, an olive hat, something like that, rather than your bright orange, bright red. Any sort of hat like that might signal that your presence before you get a chance to catch a trout. So maybe go drab, be stealthy. What else? You want to be careful when you're wading. Try not to make too much noise. That's not always true because some tailwater fisheries can be very fast, have a lot of velocity to the water. But generally, again, it's just a good idea to be stealthy anytime you're trout fishing. A couple other tips. If you're indicator fishing, indicator nymphing, use indicators that land on the water soft. When you're dealing with selective, hard to catch trout, it's best to use something like a yarn indicator or even a large dry fly with a dry and a dropper. It's an advantage to use as long of a leader as you can stand because long leaders tend to lessen the impact of your rig on the water. Again, we're trying to be stealthy in these situations. So rather than throwing the largest indicator you can find, get the smallest indicator that will still support the amount of weight needed to get to the bottom, and make sure it's as light of an indicator as possible, not very dense. And I think you'll find that you're going to catch a few more fish that way. What else? Thin tippet is a big advantage on tailwater fisheries. Thin tippet is more supple, allows your flies to drift more naturally, and very small flies drift very natural or more natural, let's say, with thinner tippet. So generally speaking on tailwater fisheries, when you're nymphing or dry fly fishing, 4X would be considered quite large diameter tippet material. 5 and 6 and even 7X would be much more popular for selective fish. So consider that when you're picking out your tippets. I would suggest most of the time in tailwaters using 5X and thinner for a nymphing and dries. That's not the case if you're fishing streamers, which can also be done in tailwaters. Then you of course want to rope up a bit to some 2X or 1X or 0, or depending on the size of your streamer. What else? There's a few other tips, and again, if you have questions, please send them over, and I'll try and answer as many questions as we can during our time here. It's really important when you're fishing tailwater fisheries to get your flies to the bottom when you're nymphing, right? Dry fly fishing, it's incredibly crucial to get them on the surface, keep them dry, but it's also important to have them drifting drag free. When you're fishing subsurface, you also need the flies to be drifting drag free, but you have an added element that you need to get the flies right near the river bottom. Think of it this way. Most tailwater fisheries you catch the most fish on very small flies, let's say 18s and smaller. Again, these are generalizations. That's not the only sizes that can be used, but most of the tailwater flies you're going to see, and most that you're going to see demonstrated tonight in these tying videos, are going to be small patterns. And if you're a trout living on the bottom of a river and a size 20 or 24 or 26 midge pupa comes drifting down the river, if it's right near your face, you're likely to eat it. But if it's 4 feet up or 3 feet up above you, you would probably use more energy rising up to take that fly than you would gain by eating it. So it's just, I don't think they think of it that way, but just instinctually they know there's no reason to use more energy than there is to get something minuscule than is needed to get something very small if it drifts right in your face. So those fish are not likely to move a long, long way to take your tiny fly. So you've just got to get flies down near the river bottom. With that said, that was a long-winded way to say add more weight. Now you want to add, whether you're Euro nymphing with just weighted flies or you're using an indicator rig with split shot or tungsten putty or whatever, you need to make sure you have the proper amount of weight to get your flies down near the river bottom. Too much weight's bad, not enough weight's bad. You got to have it right in the middle there. So that's one other tip I would have for you on making sure you're productive on a tailwater fishery, is just getting your nymphs to the bottom. What else? The fish are, again, eating small food items, so they're very selective. They're oftentimes pressured fish in tailwater fisheries. So we need to make sure we have good imitations, which some of our favorites you're going to see demonstrated here tonight. And there are lots of other great patterns from other tyers that Umpqua sells to all the fly shops around the world. So check those patterns out. But think small, oftentimes very imitative type patterns that will pique the interest of trout. And again, when people are new to fishing tailwaters, they're oftentimes perplexed by having to fish tiny, tiny flies. But I oftentimes say it's kind of akin to if you were a trout and all you'd ever let's take this a step further. If you as a human had only ever been fed T-bone steaks for breakfast, lunch, and dinner your entire life, and somebody stuck a sunflower seed in front of you, you'd have no idea that it's food, right? It doesn't look like anything you've eaten. And the same is true if you reverse that. If all you've eaten your entire life is sunflower seeds, and then all of a sudden somebody slaps a T-bone in front of you, it doesn't look like food to you. So that's kind of what the trout are up against in a tailwater fishery. When most of their food is size 18 and smaller, and we show up and throw a size 10 prince nymph or something, it's just not it's not the best imitation of what they're eating. Might you catch a few fish on it? Absolutely. But if you want to maximize your catch in situations where the fish are really used to eating very small aquatic invertebrates, you want to match those very, very small flies. So with that in mind, sorry, I got cords going over the top of my screen here. With that in mind, you want to have very small flies. You want to be imitating those sunflower seeds because that's what the fish are used to eating all the time. All right, what other tips do I have for you here? Adjusting weight. We talked about that one. We talked about rising. Good. I've got going through my notes here. Otherwise, I think if you have questions, again, send those through, and I'll try and get to those as many of those as possible. But tailwaters are a really fun challenge. I really enjoy fishing them. They're not always the easiest place to catch fish, but sometimes having a nice challenge is the most rewarding fish to catch. So if you haven't already, or if you've given up on tailwaters because they're too hard, I would encourage you to accept the challenge to learn to catch fish on tailwater fisheries. Oftentimes, if you learn to really consistently take fish on really, really tough fisheries, then it will improve your fishing everywhere, because when you go to places where the fishing is a bit easier, you'll find you catch a lot more fish because of your mastery of tougher fishing situations. All right, enough rambling from me about tailwater fisheries. Let's talk about a bit about our expert lineup tonight. We have some really cool flies, and they're from legends of the sport here. So we're going to start off with one that's one of mine, so maybe not a legend of the sport, but we're going to start off with an easy fly. That's because all of my flies are easy flies. And we're going to start off with Tungsten Tailwater Sow Bug, and it's going to be a jigged version. But after that, we're going to go through a bunch of other flies. So we're going to go through them one by one, but real quick, just so you know what's coming up here, we have the Tungsten Mercury Caddis from Pat Dorsey. We have the Medallion Midge from Pat Dorsey, the Manhattan Midge from Forrest Dorsey, the No Mercy Midge from Phil Iwane, and the Mole Midge from the one and only Charlie Craven. So with that in mind, let's cut to the first fly, the jigged tailwater sow bug. I'll show you how to tie that one, and then we'll answer any questions and chat a little bit more about tailwaters after we tie the tailwater sow bug. Hi friends on YouTube, Lance Egan here with Fly Fish Food. I'm going to show you a jigged version of my tailwater sow bug. This is one of my most popular patterns, especially on tailwater fisheries. It's great anywhere you have sow bugs or even scuds. This is a jigged version, so it'll work well as a dropper below dry, or if you want to throw it on a Euro nymph rig, it's perfect for that too. Alright, let's get tying this tailwater sow bug. So it's worth noting this is the tungsten version. You could, and it's a jigged tungsten version, you could also tie this on a standard hook that's not jigged, and you can tie them without a bead at all. So the original tailwater sow has no bead. This one, since I mostly Euro nymph and fish dry in a dropper, more so than I fish indicators, I tend to fish this version the very most. I like it on the jig hook, and I like the slotted bead. So with that in mind, I have a Hanik 400 in the vise. This is a size 16. It's my favorite go-to jig hook. And then I have a 3mm silver tungsten bead from Hanik. This is a slotted bead, so it goes over that 60-degree bend in the jig hook really easily. All right, So the first thing we're going to do is add the thread. This is 70 denier red from UTC. I'll just start the thread right behind the bead. And one thing you can do with this fly, there's a couple of variations I do. Sometimes when I'm feeling a little like I have extra free time, I suppose, I add a little Coq de Leon tail. The flies that are available from Umpqua, however, don't have the tail, so I'm not going to add that. But if you wanted to, you could add a little bit of Coq de Leon, just a short tail. Don't make it the length of the shank. Make it a pretty stubby tail. Sow bugs don't have a long, like mayfly style tail. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to just stick with the standard pattern. So next up, I'm going to add this UTC Silver Wire in small. Let's get a little bit of this off the spool here. I'm going to tie it in right behind the bead. That way I won't have a large bump at the very back of the fly. And I'll tie it all the way down the shank, right to where the bend of the hook starts. Okay, so we have, I like to capture the wire right in the little slot there to hold it in place, and then just wrap it right down the top of the shank. And then we're going to add our dubbing, which is rainbow sow scud dubbing. Rainbow sow scud dubbing from Wapsi. You can get it from Hairline as well, but the Wapsi stuff's a little bit finer, and it just comes in a one shade instead of a light and dark shade. This isn't as coarse as the Hairline. You could use either one, but I think you'll find that this is easier to dub, and I like the color a little bit better in the Wapsi product. So I'm going to just dub this on the thread. As always, less dubbing is more. You don't want too much of this. We're going to end up teasing the dubbing out, which is why this is kind of a coarse dubbing. But we're going to make a little bit of a dubbing noodle, and then I'm just going to start wrapping this up, building a bit of a body. So I'll taper it slightly, but not too much. I mostly keep it about the same. It looks like I need just one more pinch of dubbing on here. This is a pretty easy tie. All right, now I've got it wrapped up to the bead. Maybe a tiny bit of taper, a little bit thinner here at the butt end, but mostly the same throughout. Next, I'm just going to wrap the wire through the body, just spacing wraps, just like you would rib any fly. Pull it up behind the bead, capture the wire, tie it off. I know sow bugs don't have a red head, but for some reason, when you tie this fly with red thread, for me it fishes better than if I use a thread color that would imitate the actual sow bug. So now I'm going to build up a little bit of a hot spot with the thread. I like just a few extra wraps right behind the bead. I'll whip finish to get rid of the thread. And then the next step is to use your trusty Velcro tool. This is the Stonfo tool that has the Velcro on one side and the comb on the other. And I'm just going to tease this thing out quite a bit. So I'm going to really rough up the dubbing. I basically mostly tease it from the bottom to the top, pulling from both sides. You can see I've really teased that out quite a bit. And then once I've teased it out to the sides, then I'm going to kind of comb it to either side. Like that. Okay. Then the last step is to pull these fibers with your fingers to really move them to the sides. So it's pretty flat top and bottom. And then I'm going to give these a little bit of a haircut to make them a little more reasonable length, but keep some of that shape. So I'm just trimming them on the sides, and then I often go right down the back and trim it there as well. I've got one long one here I'm going to get rid of, one long one here. But otherwise, it's got kind of a little more oval profile. And this can be buggy. This doesn't need to be tightly dubbed. And then the last step is to add some permanent marker. This is a sepia colored marker, and just basically touch the back of the fly to make a dark segment. So a lot of sow bugs have scud back or flash or something like that down the back of them, and that works well. This is faster and more durable, and it leaves a little bit slimmer profile on the fly. So you don't have to have an extra material that's building up bulk, and you don't have something that's not very durable like a raffia or something that will just get pulled off the fly after a few fish anyway. That's it. Add a little bit of permanent marker down the back, silver wire, the magic rainbow sow scud dubbing, and you have a tungsten jig tailwater sow bug. right, we're back. So that was the Tungsten Tailwater sow bug in a jigged version. That is one of my most productive flies on some of our local tailwaters. A lot of our tailwaters in Utah have many sow bugs. Usually quite a few more actually sow bugs than scuds. You could tease the dubbing on that a different way and change colors if you'd like to make it more of a scud pattern. But that one works really well for me. All right, so we had a lot of questions that came in, so thank you for those while that was playing. So I'm going to try and get through as many of these as possible. First off, what is your advice on fishing tiny Euroflies to match the midge hatches on tailwaters in the winter? That's a great question and one we get a lot. It's hard to make Euro nymphs, if you will, that are heavily weighted in smaller than 22. So when you start talking 24, 26 and smaller, there's not really a good way to add a lot of weight to those. So when you're fishing that small, I would suggest fishing them as your top dropper and moving that dropper a little bit closer to the point fly. Make your point fly the weight, if you will. So you could fish an annelid imitation or a larger scud or a sow bug or a big caddis, a crane fly larva, depending on how much weight you need. You could also just fish a little Baetis or something like that that's got an oversized bead as your weight, and then have an unweighted midge just above it. That works really well. The other way to do it is to fish 18, 20, 22s. You can put tungsten beads on those, no problem, and then team them with a heavier fly. One of my tricks in the wintertime, and really I do this most of the time, when I'm Euro nymphing, I tend to put my heavy fly as my top fly when I'm fishing a 2-fly rig, and that allows the heavy fly to pull the lighter fly down with it. And what I find happens is that both of my flies get down in the strike zone a little better versus if you put the heavy fly on the point and that's pulling your rig down and your lighter fly is up above, then you only have one fly that's really in the strike zone when the fish are really lethargic and only eating in that very bottom layer of water. So maybe try a lightly weighted tungsten midge pattern behind a heavier weighted fly, or put a heavy fly on the point and an unweighted, really small midge pattern above it. That's what I would suggest trying anyway. What else? Do you have any favorite anchor flies for tailwaters, Euro or otherwise? And is there a difference between different rigs? There are some differences. Yeah, I mean, if you don't need to have a weighted fly, if you're indicator nymphing and the fish are 100% keying on really small flies, then you could just fish 2 small flies with weight with an indicator and have 2 flies that are piquing the interest of the trout. In most situations, though, I find with a Euro rig, you can find a larger fly that the fish will still eat, whether that's, again, an annelid, whether that's a large scud, a sow bug, a big caddis pattern, a stonefly nymph. You could go on and on. But there are lots and lots of larger, heavier flies that still work really well on tailwater fisheries. What else? Do you prefer to use a heavy attractor nymph or streamer over using split shot to get a small midge down? Well, it depends on the situation. I tend personally these days to do more Euro nymphing than indicator nymphing, but I've done a lot of indicator nymphing in the past, and I know you can catch fish on all those rigs. So I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer here. You could do all of those types of rigs. I don't tend to use a streamer much if I'm dead drifting nymphs. If I tend to fish a streamer, I'm either stripping it or I fish streamers on a Euro rig sometimes, and I fish just a single streamer by itself without any other flies on the rig. But split shot are a really good way to get tiny flies down, or tungsten putty, or a combination of the two. What else? Does the pattern dictate how deep to fish it? For example, larva patterns on the bottom, pupa mid-column, emergers near the top. That makes logical sense to us, yes. I would say that no, it doesn't really make a difference to the fish most of the time. Fish it can, or there are always exceptions to every rule, but generally speaking, if you fish a midge larva 3 inches from the bottom or 3 inches from the surface, you can catch fish on it both places. Logically, of course, pupa near the bottom, or sorry, larva near the bottom, pupa nearer to the surface would make more sense. But you could have a midge pupa that's right near the river bottom as well. So I think sometimes we overthink it. It's most important to have something that's close to what the fish are eating, size, silhouette, color, those sorts of things. And then most important, really, to just have it near the bottom or near the surface, depending on where those fish are feeding. All right. What else? If you're running a 2-fly rig, would you run one big weighted fly and 1 small or 2 small flies and add weight. If I'm running a 2-fly rig, I guess it depends on the water you're in, right? Every river is different. In a really large tailwater, you might need a really large, heavy fly to get down. On smaller tailwaters with lower flows, you don't need to have very much weight to help you get down. So it's hard to answer that question without knowing where you're fishing. But you only need as much weight as you need, right? It's silly to say, but that's the truth. You got to get down to the bottom. If you have too much weight, whether you're indicator nymphing with split shot or you're Euro nymphing with just weighted flies, too much weight's bad. Not enough weight's also bad. There's a happy medium in there. What's a good range of weights to use? Well, weights come in different ways of measuring them. Some come in weight, actual. Some are arbitrary, like A, B, B, B. It's hard to say you got to take this exact one, but I would argue when you're fishing weight, I like to use small weights. So BB size shot are rare for me to use. They're large, but again, I mostly fish smaller rivers. In larger rivers, they might be absolutely necessary, but I find it's better to have a chain of small shots. So really, really small, like, size 6s, size 8s, split shot. And then if you need to adjust and add weight, it's better to have a chain of 5 or 6 of them than it is to have one big shot. The chains tend to hang up less, and you can adjust or fine tune them better. The other way to do that is to put 1 or 2 small split shot on and then use the tungsten putty and mold little pieces of tungsten putty around those shot. That's a great way to add and subtract small amounts of weight too. All right. Few chatting points about the importance of mending your line. Less specific question. Yeah, chatting points. Well, mending your line is crucial when you're fishing dries, dry dropper, or indicator rigs. You've got to get those flies drifting drag free. So repositioning your line to accommodate a drag free drift is absolutely crucial. With a Euro rig, there is no mending of lines, so you don't need to do it then. What else? Is there a reason for the different thread colors between the versions? I assume this person is talking about versions of tailwater, my tailwater sow bugs, because there's another one I've done on the internet that uses watery olive thread. And yeah, it's just different versions of flies. Some days they favor one versus the other. The most consistent for me is the one we just showed here with the red thread, but there are also days where they like that kind of more green olive color on the watery olive version. What else? Is it true that if anybody even touches Cheech's purple vise, he loses his cookies? No. My arms are pretty long, but it's just barely out of my reach, but I touch it all the time, and Cheech doesn't lose his cookies. Have you seen him? He doesn't lose cookies ever. I'm always looking for a better scud pattern. Do you have a go-to scud? For those of you who don't know, Cheech is somebody I work with, and he has a fancy purple vise he calls the purple popsicle. And he's kind of an eccentric person, so we don't need to talk anymore about him. Anyway, I'm always looking for a better scud pattern. Do you have a go-to scud? I really don't have a go-to scud that's a named scud, if you will, that's available all the time. I don't fish a ton of scuds, but when I do, they're just simple dubbing scuds, much like that sow bug, except sow bugs tend to be wide and flat. Scuds tend to be tall and narrow. So if you tease the same fly we just showed, but you tease the dubbing down or tease it up as if you like, maybe on a jig fly, to make it more tall and narrow, and then change colors to your heart's delight. A lot of scuds are olive or gray olive. Dying scuds or dead scuds can often be orange or kind of amber colored. That's simple of a tie, just some dubbing, a little bit of wire. You can color the back with a marker. You can pull plastic or scud back over the back. You can add a little bit of antenna and tail if you like with hackle fibers or partridge or something like that. But I don't have a particular scud that I fish a lot. There are some good ones out there though. There are Kaufman scuds are some that we sell a lot in the shop here, just like the olive gray Kaufman scud. Those are always good. All right. If you have more questions again, please send them through. We'll get to as many of those as we can. Next up, we have a cool fly from Pat Dorsey called the Tungsten Mercury Case Caddis. Pat is an absolute legend in fly fishing and a legend on tailwaters. He guides on tailwaters as much as anybody I know. So I'm looking forward to seeing some of his patterns. So the next two are from Pat, and this first one is called his Tungsten Mercury Caddis.
Good evening, everyone. Pat Dorsey here, Umpqua fly designer. Tonight, we're going to tie a Mercury tungsten bead cased caddis. I tied the original Mercury caddis a few years ago and then recently came out with the tungsten variation to increase the sink rates. It's important to note that this does use a silver lined glass bead, the Mercury bead, which is available in two different sizes, a small and an extra small. Most of the patterns that I tie use the extra small, but this uses the small, so that's very important to note. And then the bead is a tungsten bead. This is a 2.5 black bead, but it is turned around backwards, so the countersunk side butts up with the silver lined glass bead. So those are a couple important things here. Hook is a Tiemco 200R, which is a great hook for this type of fly. We'll begin with some 6/0 uni thread jam knot behind the bead. We'll get us a little thread wedge built in there to secure those beads. And one thing that I like to do is just adjust those beads, get them straight before I put some final pressure to lock those beads into place. Then we'll advance the thread back rearward towards hook bend. And we're going to take some hare's mask dubbing. I typically blend my own hare's mask up just so that I can have a lot of guard hairs in the mixture. This pattern typically is going to look a little on the messy side if it's tied well. We'll begin with a little bit of dubbing and we'll start to develop a nice little body. I'm sure you're familiar with cased caddis, and this particular version is a brachicentris, which really constitutes the Mother's Day caddis hatch. You've probably hooked a little twig-like looking apparatus on your fly from time to time, and that's actually a brachicentris caddis. If you actually squeeze that little twig, you'll see that inside of it is the actual larva. So with this hare's mask dubbing, we're actually creating the case itself, and it has a nice taper from the bend of the hook up towards the bead. The black bead will simulate the head, and the larva will tie out of some UV chartreuse dubbing. We'll take a little band of chartreuse dubbing. We'll tie it right in behind bead there, and then we'll just take a couple turns there. And a lot of times what I like to do is I'll take some black Sharpie here and color that tan thread black prior to whip finishing. And we'll clip off our thread. So we have the Mercury bead, which highlights that gas bubble effect that takes place during a caddis emergence. We have the tungsten bead to increase the sink rate, and that little band of chartreuse dubbing becomes a trigger and attracts nearby trout. Typically, this is fished mornings and evenings. When behavioral drift occurs, that's when it's really a deadly pattern. But brachicentris are really become victims of catastrophic drift as well. So there's really never a bad time to fish this pattern. I hope you enjoy this pattern as much as I have over the years. It's truly one of my favorite attractors for much of the year.
All right, perfect. That was a cool fly from Pat Dorsey. As you can see, I think anyway, Pat is a true fly fishing guide. You can tell guides flies apart from, I think, those that spend very little time on the water, because guides need to have flies that are effective but very simple to tie, and that's absolutely nailed. It's just easy, durable. I'm sure if Pat was guiding tomorrow and he needed more of those case caddis, he could whip up a dozen of them in 20 or 30 minutes, and he's ready for the day. Perfect guide fly. That's a cool case caddis. All right, while Pat was tying, we had lots of other questions that snuck in, so let's get to some of those. Let's see. If you could fish only one fly on tailwaters for the rest of your life, what would it be? I would never do that. Never. That's my answer. I would never limit myself like that. So sorry, I don't like those kinds of questions. That's like saying, if you could only fish one river the rest of your life, which would it be? I would never want to do that to myself. So that's my answer. Sorry. What do you think about leeches in winter on tailwaters? Leeches are awesome. Leeches, little streamers. I fish them all the time. You can dead drift them. You can jig them. You can strip them. There's all kinds of good stuff on tailwaters with leeches, and even just small minnow imitations, little sculpin patterns, and that same stuff. Very, very effective on tailwaters. Next question: what types of dry flies might we see on a tailwater in the winter? Midges mostly. Possibly, winter, early winter, late winter, some Baetis as well, some blooming olives. Around here, we also late winter see some really tiny winter stones, some little stone flies that are like size 16, 18 size stones. But mostly, you're going to see midges in the wintertime. When the water's cold, that's going to be the most prolific insect for sure. How much time do you give a particular rig before making changes? What's your strategy with making changes to a multi-fly rig? That's hard to answer. Again, based on what's going on. If you know the fish are really active, if you can see fish and you're not catching them, then I'm changing really quickly. If it feels like the water's super cold and the fish aren't very active and I'm really confident in my flies, then I'm not changing them very often. If I've gone an hour and I haven't caught anything, then I'm probably going to be changing stuff up a bit. But it changes day to day for sure. All right, next question. Still curious about Euro jigging large flies. For example, size 8s with 4.5 millimeter beads, fluffy stuff. Seeing a renaissance, lots of interest out east. Yeah, definitely here too. Jigging streamers and jigging flies is very, very productive at times. So I'd encourage you to do it anywhere you find trout. It's not limited to a geographical area. East, west, Europe, doesn't matter. Tasmania, New Zealand, they're going to eat jigged flies for sure. Another question, how do you remove split shot from your line? I can't ever get it off with cutting line below it. I think they meant without cutting line below it. Well, there's a couple ways. One is my favorite way to add split shot is add split shot below the flies. So more like a bounce rig, we call it locally, or some places they call it a drop shot rig. And there's a couple schools of thought. One is to tie an overhand knot in the terminal end of the tippet, and then the split shot kind of butt up against that knot, and you can slide them up and cut the knot and just slide them off if you'd like. Or the other school of thought is to leave a long tag on the end of that tippet, and don't put the split shot right on the terminal end of the tag. Put it up 3 or 4 inches and pinch that bottom shot super tight. So tight that it's going to damage the tippet. Now you got to remember, you don't want to do this when your shot are above your flies, because damaged tippet between yourself and the flies is a bad idea. But damaging the tippet below your flies doesn't matter. So if you crimp that bottom split shot really, really tight and leave a tag end on there, it will not. It's likely to slide over the course of a few hours. But if you're pretty diligent about checking it, when you want to get that one off, you just literally slide it off the end and pinch the next one tighter. That's another way to get split shot off the line. Otherwise, forceps, pliers, trying to, if you smash them this way, trying to smash them the other direction to open the shot back up is a possibility, but there's not really a great way to get shot off. You can also buy the shot that have the little ears on them, the little tabs that open the shot up. That does make them easier to remove. Those shot also twist your leader more and tend to get snagged more, so it's a give and take. Do you value having the ability to get the shot off easier, or value retying and losing more rigs? I don't like those shot with the little tabs on them very much, but they're certainly still, you can catch fish with them, no doubt. All right, let's take a break from more questions here, and keep them coming. If you've got more, we'll keep getting to them. But let's do another fly from Pat Dorsey. This time we're going to do his Medallion Midge.
Hello, everyone. Pat Dorsey here, Umpqua Signature Fly Designer. Tonight, we're going to tie the Medallion Midge. This fly came about shortly after I invented the top secret midge and uses a very similar abdomen construction, but a much more realistic thorax area. We'll begin. I have a Tiemco 101 clamped into my vise, and I'm going to tie a jam knot out of 8/0 uni thread. As I mentioned, the abdomen is constructed similar to that of the Top Secret, and we'll take a piece of 6/0 white thread and we'll advance it rearward towards hook bend with symmetrical touching wraps. Once we get back towards the bend, we'll advance the thread forward. Rather than counter ribbing this fly, we're going to actually take this white thread and go in a clockwise rotation with a medium tension. The hardest part about this fly is getting a clean segmented abdomen. With the correct tension and using a new piece of white thread for every fly, that seems to take care of that problem that most fly tyers encounter with the abdomen. The thorax is tied out of material called medallion sheeting. And this is medium dun in color. And we'll advance our thread back to about the 50% point on the hook shank and tie in a piece of medallion sheeting that's about 1/8 inch in diameter. For the wing pad, we'll tie in a separate piece of medallion sheeting, letting it extend up over the other two pieces of medallion sheeting that will be used for the wing buds. The thorax is tied out of superfine rust brown. Midge pupa, prior to emergence, they have a robust thorax which contains the wings and the legs of the emerging adult. So we're going to place a nice little ball of dubbing right in that thorax. Looks like a little miniature football. And we'll pull the wing beds forward. Pull the one wing bed forward, take 2 material locking wraps. Pull the front wing bed forward, take 2 material locking wraps. Pull those out of the way, then we'll pull the wing pad over the top. Take 2 material locking wraps. Then we'll snip the materials. We'll pull back the rearward wing bud, front wing bud, and then we'll whip finish. Some patterns are very generic looking and some patterns are very realistic looking. So when I designed this pattern, I was looking to create a super realistic looking pupa pattern. We'll trim the buds. And then the final step is just to round the buds off. Simply taking the scissors and just trimming off the corners. And a good sharp pair of scissors is critical on that. But there you have a completed Medallion Midge. Truly one of my favorite patterns. Typically when I see that a midge hatch is in progress, I'll typically fish this mid column with a size 6 split shot, just by indicator to about 1.5 times the depth of the current, and just try to keep my fly right in that correct feeding zone. I hope you have as much faith and confidence in the Medallion Midge as I do over the years. Have fun at the vise.
All right, another cool fly from old Pat. That is another classic example of a guide fly. That one's a little more techy, I think, with the medallion sheeting, a little more lifelike, very imitative. That's one I've never fished. I need to try that one. When I was preparing for this, that was the first time I'd seen that little medallion midge, and that looks really, really deadly. I'm sure that the fish locally will eat that one up. Before we move on, I had a couple of things I wanted to share. I reached out to each of the tyers and got a little background on each of their flies. So if we could back up one step to Pat's Tungsten Mercury Caddis he did just a second ago, he talked a lot about some of the features of it. There were a couple things he shared with me that I wanted to kind of share on this as well. He said Let's see. It has a buggy appearance. Yep, he talked about that with the hairs here. There was a part in here. There we go. The tungsten mercury caddis is especially deadly during low light conditions, dawn or dusk, because that is when the highest number of caddis larvae are moving about as a result of behavioral drift. This is really, I think, an important part of that pattern. The mercury caddis is an excellent attractor in a 2 or 3 fly tandem nymphing rig and also works well in Euro rigs. It's dense. That's a great fly for sure. Thanks for sharing that with us, Pat. And then on the Medallion Midge that he just showed us, he said, I designed the Medallion Midge pupa with selective trout in mind. Instead of a simple generic pattern like the Black Beauty that is comprised of thread, wire, and dubbing, I wanted to create a more realistic midge pupa, which I think he really did with that Medallion Midge. That's really cool. The abdomen is constructed similar to the Top Secret Midge using 2 different colors of thread, producing a beautiful, extremely durable, segmented body. Again, guide fly extraordinaire, Mr. Pat Dorsey. The original pattern uses A-dot dark brown uni-thread, which he talked about, and the body and 6-aught uni for the rib. The thorax is constructed from medallion sheeting, from which the fly takes its name. Medallion sheeting is available in lots of colors, and that makes the pattern variations as simple as changing colors of the thread, abdomen, and medallion sheeting. Air bubbles get trapped between the dub thorax and the wing buds, producing the imitation of the gas bubble that forms on the natural. So that's a really, really cool fly, I think, that Pat's come up with, and also very simple and quick to tie, which is just perfect, I think. All right, we had a few more questions before we get to the next fly. Let's see here. Where do the new questions start? All right. Does George Daniel make you listen to Blake Shelton playlist? Oh, to his Blake Shelton playlist on the boat? No, because George is a professional and he doesn't listen to music on the boat. Who would do that? And I've never heard of Blake Shelton. Who is she? I don't know. Your preference between tungsten putty or split shot? Well, I don't really have a preference. Why not use both? Split shot, add a lot of weight. Tungsten putty is a good way to add just little bits of weight. And if you add only tungsten putty, it tends to not stay on the line very well. Even if you put it around a knot, which is the best way to do it, I think, if you're just using the putty alone, it doesn't stay put very well. If you put it around split shot, it stays on much better. Next question, being that the water temps are more consistent versus freestone, whereas temps are colder, thus the fish are not as active, do you find the fish throughout the water column? Yes, sometimes you do. When you get a good midge emergence, you can find fish suspended on our local tailwaters here. We often have midge hatches all winter long, every single day. You'll often find rising fish all winter long, and when you have fish rising at the surface, you'll also have some fish eating pupa right below the surface, and there are always fish to be caught near the river bottom. So absolutely. Do you notice a difference between the fish themselves in tailwater versus non? Not really, not in the fish, their behavior, but I don't really notice a big difference in just the fish. That varies a lot more fishery to fishery. Do you have a preference in bead color? I know a lot of Spanish anglers switch from silver to copper beads late in the season. I have preferences in bead color. I don't necessarily switch them based on season. I'm not saying that that's wrong. That's just not the way that I do it. I have more just, it's a confidence thing for me. Most of my midges I'm tying with, say, silver, occasionally copper beads. Most of my sow bugs and crustaceans I'm tying with silver beads. A lot of my mayflies I'm tying with gold or silver beads. Attractor patterns I tend to use gold beads or bright pink, bright orange beads, those kinds of things. That just varies a lot pattern to pattern. I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer there. What else? Next question, are there instances where you might prefer an inverted tungsten bead over a slotted tungsten bead? There could be some, yeah. Sometimes the inverted beads, like the Umpqua jig bombs, can be a little bit heavier per size than a regular slotted bead. They don't have as much of the tungsten cut away. So when you really need the ultimate amount of weight, sometimes those jig bombs would be a better option. Otherwise, I don't notice a giant difference as far as I don't notice any difference at all as far as how the fish react to them. But just getting down can be really important. Next question, do you ever fish nylon for Euro nymphing on pressured tail waters for more softness in the drift? It's a trade-off with abrasion resistance. It's a good question. I really don't anymore. I certainly used to. I caught a lot of fish before fluorocarbon was really popular. I caught a lot of fish just fishing 6X nylon. And I wouldn't tell you you can't, but I really don't personally. To answer your question, I don't even carry nylon tippet on my river setups in any of my fly fishing setups really. I use a lot of nylon leaders, but all of my tippet is fluorocarbon. You can get fluorocarbon in different suppleness as well, and then just going thinner in fluorocarbon will make it much softer. How long is your typical indicator leader? Well, that varies depending on how big a water or how much depth you need to achieve. Generally speaking, my indicator leaders would be in the 9 to like 12-foot range. But if I were fishing a small stream, they might be shorter. Or if I was going to try and do a lot of high sticking with it, I might make them much, much longer than that to try and take as much fly line off the water as possible. It's a good question, though. So the medallion sheeting, have you found good supplements? With COVID, I found it harder to find, and here the company may discontinue it. Yes, that is a problem with medallion sheeting. I was chatting with Pat about that, and I know he's searching for a new source. It has been discontinued from the supplier. We have had a hard time getting it in our shop too. So I don't know that it's not COVID related, but I don't think that it's actually COVID related. I just think it's a material that's going away. So I'm sure Pat will find some sort of cool substitute for us, and maybe keep a lookout on Blue Quill Angler's website, or just message Pat direct and see if he ever finds any substitutes for it. All right, that's all the questions we have for now. So again, keep them coming. We're going to go to another fly here in just a second. This one's from the legend Forrest Dorsey, who is the son of legendary Pat Dorsey. So we're Dorsey-centric here. This is awesome, a father-son combo. I reached out to Forrest, and he had some cool thoughts on this next fly that's called the Manhattan Midge. He says the Manhattan Midge was one of the first patterns I developed to fool selective Rocky Mountain trout. The Manhattan Midge is a souped-up hybrid of the top secret midge, Mercury Black Beauty, and Mercury Blood Midge that incorporates the best attributes of each pattern. It has a slim profile, segmented body, a flashy wing, peacock collar that breathes life, and a clear silver-lined bead to imitate trapped air in the thorax. Flash forward over the years, now the Manhattan Midge has become a guide favorite on the South Platte River, Cheeseman Decker's 11-Mile Canyon, and the Charlie Myers State Wildlife Area. And its effectiveness has spread to eastern tailwaters also. Funny story, says Forrest. He says the Manhattan Midge was developed in Manhattan, literally like in New York, in a small New York City apartment where my friend Jay Park was living at the time. We were both Colorado boys that felt trapped in New York City for a short time. Our outlet was meeting up for tying sessions a couple times a week. We would watch fly fishing films, tie flies, and dream about fishing the flies. Now, it's cool stuff, and I look forward to seeing good old Forrest show us how to tie his Manhattan Midge.
Hello, this is Forrest Dorsey, Umpqua fly designer. Tonight I want to share a pattern with you called the Manhattan Midge. This is one pattern that I developed while I was living in New York City during the winter, tying a lot of flies, dreaming about fishing, and just creating tons of different midge patterns. And essentially what it is, it's a souped up Black Beauty, Mercury Midge, and Top Secret Midge, kind of morphed into one, takes the best qualities out of each one. It's a 2488 with a silver line glass bead on it. I'm going to start off with some 14-aught Vivus black thread with a little jam knot there. The segmentation of this fly is going to be small copper wire. I'm going to take my thread down to the bend, smooth, connected wraps, and back to the front. I'm going to take my copper wire and have very segmented wraps. The more the merrier on this pattern. With a couple wraps to tie it off. And take that copper wire and just helicopter it or cut it off. I like to save the scissors, so just do a helicopter on that. The wing for this midge is going to be Glamour Madeira, the same thing as the Top Secret Midge. And then the thorax will be some peacock. I like to take this from the peacock eyes because they're just naturally sized. So you can tie anything from 16 all the way down to 24. Cut off the tip of that peacock and tie it in. Couple wraps towards the glass bead. And then I'm going to tie off that peacock. Whip finish. And this fly's done. Last thing to do is cut off the wing. Fold that over a little bit. And you can fluff it out. If you got a little carried away with the peacock, you can trim that up too. This has been one of my favorite midge patterns anywhere on the South Platte to the South Holston. Tie some up and try it today.
All right, that was a cool one. The Manhattan Midge from Forest. That's been a really popular fly in our shop for our local tailwaters too. It's got the right amount of bugginess, still the right amount of imitative qualities too. Comes in different colors. I know he showed us the black one, but we carry it in red, and it comes in some other olive, I believe, and brown too. So cool fly. If you haven't tried that one, I recommend checking it out. All right. We have some more questions that came in while Forrest was tying for us. Let's see here. What are the best resources for entomology in each river? I fish Cheeseman Canyon most. Thanks so much. The best resources are, I would say, talking to your local fly shop. Most of the really quality guides and fly shops are going to know their local rivers very, very well. But if you can't get any good answers from the fly shop, then go grab a seine and start collecting bugs and seeing what's in the drift in your local river. Another way to do it that's a little bit controversial, but using a little throat pump is a good way to see which flies the fish are eating. You can kick up a bunch of bugs with a seine on the bottom of the river, and it tells you what lives in the river, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what the fish are keying on right then and there. So sometimes I wouldn't recommend doing it on fish all day long, but if you want to pump a fish here and there, you can see what they're feeding on right at that very instance. What else? Next question, how much do you find of this applies to large tailwaters, say the lower Deschutes, where you might be fishing 50 miles or more below the dam? That's a good question. I have fished the Deschutes, but I'm definitely no expert on the Deschutes. I know the Deschutes is known for its salmon fly hatches. So, the really small flies I don't think are very important on the Deschutes. I think you could get by with much, much larger flies. And I would wager that the closer to the dam you get, maybe the more important that kind of stuff is. And the further away from the dam you get, the more it probably acts like a freestone river. The Deschutes is a mover. I know that. It has a lot of velocity to it. It's got a lot of beautiful riffles and pocket water stretches too. So it's definitely one of the tailwaters that acts a lot like a freestone. So I don't know that it's the tiny fly stuff's not totally transferable, I think is the point you're making there, and I think it's a valid one. You don't always have to fish tiny flies on tailwaters. Next question, any specific fishing techniques while fishing midge emergers to provoke takes? I think the main things are having the right size and color and silhouette of the midge larva and pupa they're eating. Otherwise, it's just getting them in that right zone, getting those flies, whether that's near the bottom or if that's right near the surface of the water. You can fish those types of flies below a dry fly. You can fish them on a grease leader, a leader that you've added floating to the whole thing, except just the last little bit to only let a little bit of tippet get your fly down. And you can fish them on indicator or Euro rigs to get them right near the bottom. So depending on where you're seeing active fish, you need to focus your efforts in that part of the water column. What else? Next question, do you think tippet size really matters when using an indicator rig? Do the fish really care? For nymphing, I just rock 4 or 5X. Well, yeah, I think it does matter, certainly. I don't think that the fish care, and that I'm not, you'll never convince me that fish look at your tippet and go, I would probably eat that fly, but that's 4X, and if it's not 5 or thinner, I'm not eating it. They're never doing that. I don't believe that. I don't think that, honestly, I don't believe that that clarity of tippet is really that important. The reason I think that is if you have a hook and you have tippet, clear tippet, whether it's nylon or fluorocarbon tied to that hook, why on earth would the fish focus on that clear section of something that's added to the fly and not the hook that's not clear at all? Whether it's bronze, black, nickel, I don't care what color of hook you're using, they're not focused on the negatives like that. What I do think makes a big difference is the softness, the suppleness of the tippet, which is directly affected by diameter. So thinner tippet, to me, is not important for the fish seeing the tippet. It's important to make the fly drift more natural. Thinner tippet makes your fly more at the mercy of the currents. So I think you'll get more strikes if you go thinner, but you also go through more tippet and more flies, and you retie more often. So you have to balance that with your skill set and and the size of fish you're catching and so on. There's no hard set rule that says you have to always fish 6x everywhere or 5x or whatever. You got to base it on each situation. Some rivers 4x is really thin because the fish are really big and there's a lot of speed to the current, and anything lighter makes it so you have to fight the fish too long. So you just got to play it by ear. What else? Guy says, I fished the Provo with a guide out of your shop. I had a solid day and caught my best brown of 2021. He says, with maybe Josh, and a question mark. Yeah, I bet you did fish with Josh Mena. He's a great guide out of our shop. We actually don't guide out of the shop, but he guides for another guide service here. And he's a very, very skilled guide near Midway. Is that a tailwater, they're asking? I see, yes, the Provo River near Midway is a tailwater. We have two sections of the Provo locally that are tailwaters. The lower, we call it, that's below Deer Creek Reservoir, and the middle Provo below Jordanelle Reservoir. So that was a tailwater that you fished. Next question, I'm going to the Bighorn this spring. Any tips? Well, I've only fished the Bighorn about this much, so I'm definitely no expert. I would reach out to the local guides and shops there. They're going to know a lot more about it than I will. Having fished it a little, though, I would suggest you have lots of sow bugs. The tailwater sow bug that we showed you here just a minute ago, it has been deadly there for me. And I know that Umpqua dealers in that area sell a lot of sow bugs. So that's something I would have in your box for sure. Otherwise, in the spring, try annelid patterns. Try small betas, see little blooming olive patterns, bar emergers. Any of Pat's like Mercury patterns, the Mercury Black Beauties and things like that for midge larvae and pupa would be really good. I would try a Rainbow Warrior. Those would all be good things for the Bighorn. And then, like I say, reach out to the local shops. They're going to know a lot more than I know about their local fisheries. What else? Are your Euro patterns effective on an indicator rig or on non-jig hooks? Absolutely, yeah. Jig hooks are not a necessity to make a pattern work. They're just a way to invert a hook. So Euro patterns are definitely effective on an indicator rig. We fish them all the time, just without shot even, just an indicator with a couple of tungsten nymphs or jig nymphs below a dry fly. They don't have to be, Euro nymphs, number one, don't have to be on jig hooks. And when you're indicator nymphing, you could use any fly that the fish will eat. It doesn't matter what kind of hook it's on, as long as it's a quality hook like a Tiemco or an Umpqua, something that will hold them. All right, that's all the questions I think we have for this round. So we still have some more flies to get to. Next up, we have the No Mercy Midge from Phil Awane. And he shared a bit about his cool fly here. So let me read this real quick, and then we'll get to Phil's tying. He says, here's a little history of my No Mercy Midge. In 2006, I wanted to develop a midge that would be highly effective in the waters of Colorado. I collected samples of midges in the South Platte River, specifically 11 Mile Canyon and Cheeseman Canyon, as well as looked at photos of the naturals and began developing this fly. I wanted to make sure that the midge had properties that created a trigger reaction from the trout when presented the fly. While developing this fly, I knew that the mayfly coexisted with the midge, so I thought if I could also make it look close enough to a mayfly emerger that it would even be more effective. The selection of the hook is where I began. Initially, I tried the Tiemco 101, 100, and the 200R, but I wanted a hook with a larger gape. I ended up selecting the Tiemco 2488 because of that gape, the curve of the hook, and the short shank. The next step was to select the materials for my No Mercy Midge. I observed that the abdomen of the natural was brownish in color. The head was black, the gills were white, and finally there was a translucent shine to the natural. I tried every color of brown thread and came up with Unithread Camel A-Dot. that's a there's something to that. We've had a couple of our experts using unit thread, ADOT, and camel. So if you don't own that, maybe next time you're in the shop, grab yourself a spool. He goes on to say, then I added extra small silver ribbing for segmentation. Switched to CDC tufts because of the movement of the material. Pointed the CDC forward and coated the abdomen and head with UV resin. Since, let's see, he talks a little bit more about the resin. Other colors of this pattern that work for the abdomen are red, gray, black, cream, olive, tan, orange, blue, pink, and white. There's a whole bunch of color combos you guys can try. Camel does catch more fish, but all the other colors work well depending on the river and color of the midge in that specific river. The size that works best for him is 24 and 22, but I've done well at the Eagle River and the Frying Pan using a size 18, says Phil. In 14 years of fishing my No Mercy Midge, I have caught thousands of fish, both small and large, in every river in Colorado. The San Juan River, the Provo, Bighorn River, etc. So there's another one for the Bighorn, this next fly. I fish this fly at all depths in the water column as well as on the surface. I believe this midge will work wherever there are midges. People that use this fly come to me at shows and fly tying demos and tell me that they have caught many fish, and some have said that they caught the largest trout of their lives. And I think it's really cool that they're catching fish using my No Mercy Midge. So let's watch Phil tie his No Mercy Midge.
Hello, I'm going to be tying my No Mercy Midge. It's a midge pupa that I designed about 13, 14 years ago. Highly effective in any tailwater, any river actually. I've fished it all throughout Colorado as well as the San Juan. But what I'm going to be using is I'm going to be using a TMC 2488 hook. Normally I tie them in a size 22 or 24, but this is a little larger so you can see what I'm doing. Highly effective. I mean, I've caught thousands and thousands and thousands of fish with it. So anyway, I'm going to be using camel uni thread of ADOT and just palmer it down. You want to go about halfway down the straight part of the shank of the hook. And then I'm going to be tying in Lagarton wire. You can use UTC extra small. This happens to be Lagarton silver extra fine. And I spin my thread, my bobbin, just to make it easier to tie material in. I can do it without it, but I find that it's just easier. And I'm not production tying, so it's not like I have to tie thousands of flies. Just start it and then just pull on the wire to get it so the tag end is covered by the thread. And you're going to take your camel thread and go past the bend of the hook all the way to the point where it's vertical. It's all the way down, and then just return it to the eye of the hook. Then I'm going to take this wire and palmer it up towards the eye of the hook. This is a segmentation of the midge. And I'm just alternating hands. And if you put 2 wraps of thread over the wire, it'll secure it so you can break it off and tie it off. I'm using Vivas 14-aught black thread. I'm going to make a head with it. And then the actual wing or the gills, I'm using CDC tufts. Don't use the quills. It's easier to tie in if you're using the tufts. It's more pliable, so it moves more in the water. So right now, this material you can see is all flared. It's hard to tie in flared material, so just wet it. It gathers the material. And you can usually make two flies out of one tuft. Sometimes if the tufts are longer, you can make 3, but it's relatively inexpensive material. And you see, I can just lasso it. I don't have to, I don't have to move it around. I don't have to hold it extra hard. And then just take your scissors and go all the way up to the thread and just snip it. And then I'm going to build a head with this black thread. You don't want to make it too large because the actual midge itself, the head is just a little bit larger than the abdomen. And then I tie it off in the middle of the head. That way it stays tapered. The exoskeleton of a midge is actually shiny. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some UV resin over the head and the abdomen of this fly. Hit it with the UV light. Cut this about 4 to 5 hook eyes. And that's it. My No Mercy Midge. It's killer. I mean, it's when people say, what's a good pattern? For me, it's not like catching 2 or 3 fish in a day. This one here on a good day, and if the fish are there, I mean, I'm talking 40, 50 fish. So a very effective fly anywhere there's midges, which is pretty much every river and stream in the United States.
All right, thanks, Phil. That's a cool fly. I think if you've been paying attention, other than my silly crustacean at the beginning, you've seen a real pattern here. The tailwater flies are very small, very sparse, very thin. A lot of times when we see people bring their homemade flies in, when they're trying to get started in fly tying, they tend to make them a little bit too bulky, a little too thick. We want these things to be thin on a good diet plan. So make sure you're tying your flies very, very sparse. Phil did a great job of showing us how thin they can be, as did Forrest and Pat. All right, that was Phil's No Mercy Midge. Moving on to some more questions. Any tips for a true beginner in fly fishing with a tailwater? Well, tailwaters can be tricky. So when you're a brand new fly fisher, I would tell you to just, again, accept it as a challenge. Know that it's going to be tough. But if you can figure out ways to catch those fish, it's going to benefit your fishing long term. A few tips, again, like we started with, be stealthy, use as long leaders as you can, get really small with your flies, be imitative when it's the best idea, and be more attractor. Put attractor patterns on there when the fish are really, really active. Make sure you're getting your flies to the depth where the fish are feeding, whether that's on the surface or in the middle of the column, or most commonly near the river bottom. That sounds really easy, but most people really struggle at getting flies down to the zone near the river bottom where most of the feeding is taking place. And when you don't have those flies in that zone and they're not drifting the right speed in that zone, then you're not catching fish. So those are the main things. You'll have to mend and manipulate your line, or high stick and keep line and leader off the water to achieve the best drift possible. What's next here? Any love for the RS2 or WD-40? Just wondering if you ever had a client ask if presentation is more important, why do we carry so many fly patterns? Good question. Yeah, absolutely. RS2s and WD-40s are very effective. Great tailwater flies, for sure. I'd recommend having them in every box. Well, to answer that, the last part of that question, is presentation more important? If it is more important, why do we carry so many patterns? Well, we like to tie flies, that's why. And there are days where even our confidence flies are not working, so we need to have some backup plans. Tying flies is fun, and trying new patterns on the water and seeing which patterns the fish will eat is also a fun process. So I think that's part of the appeal. And then let's be honest, when we're out fishing, we don't usually look at ourselves as the problem. Most of us look at our flies. We blame, oh, I just must not have the right flies. So it's a natural feeling, I guess, a natural inclination to want to try new patterns because we're always convinced that it's not us. It's just if we had the right flies, we'd be catching all the fish. And there's some truth to that. Flies make a difference. But I think more often than not, you could take most of these patterns that we've shown you so far today and catch fish on lots of tailwaters if they're presented properly. All right. Next up, we have another fly for you from a small man that's kind of a big deal, Mr. Charlie Craven. I call him a small man because if you know anything about me and Charlie, we have a little bit of a rivalry. I don't really know why we do, actually, and it's totally harmless. We're both good buddies, but we like to tease each other a little bit. So because he's a little bit shorter than I am, I like to tease him about being muy pequeño. But he is a big deal. He's a fantastic fly tyer, a fantastic fisherman, and he's got a cool fly for us on tap here. He calls his mole midge. I reached out to Charlie to get a few bullet points about his fly. So let me just read real quickly what he sent to me. He says the mole midge is a takeoff of the mole fly. The mole fly, he has mole flies and other colors and sizes in addition to this pattern. It's a super effective low floating midge emerger pattern meant to be fished dry, but lots of people also fish it under the surface. The body has Polish strip peacock quill, and it's coated with a little bit of UV resin. It's a super cool body. It's also, I would add to that, that it's very durable because of the resin. The mole midge has just enough CDC to sit in the film, and you can always mash it up a bit to alter the profile. Charlie goes on to say, I usually dress the CDC with a little Tiemco dry magic, so that he would be doing that when he's fishing it on the surface. This is a cool fly, and it's one that's very, very imitative, but it's also an easy fly for fish to get in their mouth because there's nothing really getting in the way of the hook. There's nothing impeding that hook gap. So without further ado, the man, the myth, the legend, Charlie Craven, showing us how to do his mole midge.
Hey everybody, and welcome to the Charlie Craven Show. Today I'm going to tie for you a very simple little pattern called a mole midge that is a takeoff of my original mole fly, which is probably the most effective dry fly I've ever fished. And this is a slightly skinnier version made more specifically to fish for emerging midges. So I'm going to start off with a Tiemco 2487. This is curve shank hook, but with the down eye, and you specifically want the down-eyed version. It affects the way the fly sits in the water. We want the fly, I'll show you when we're done, the way we want the fly to sit in the water, but we want the eye to basically lay on the surface and the body of the fly to hang below. But like I said, this is a very simple fly. I'm going to start off with some 14-aught Vivas, and I'm going to use black here, and I know that might be a little hard to see, but you'll deal with it. I believe in you. But I'm going to start this thread just up behind the eye here. And I'll just dress, maybe the front third or so of the shank. And leave the thread hanging right behind the eye. Now, this is a fairly dark little fly, and it sits very low in the water, which is part of the reason why it works so well. But what I want to do is I'm going to add just a few strands of fluorofiber. And this is white. And what I've got here is 3 strands. You can see they're fairly shiny. So 3 strands of white fluorofiber. And I'm going to catch these here just behind the eye. Just take a couple turns back over them, and then I'll fold them forward again. Like so. You guys can't see, but there's one little frayed piece of thread right there. There was. There's not anymore because I fixed it. So we've just got that little tuft of white fluorofiber sticking out over the hook eye. And that's to give a little reflection to the wing, make it a little easier to see. Now the wing on this fly, this is an advanced wing fly, which means the wing is going to stick out over the hook eye. So rather than lay back over the body, it's going to stick out over the hook eye and is meant to imitate the midge pupa as the adult is emerging from the husk. So with that, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take 2 CDC feathers. And if you're tying these really tiny, this is an 18 I'm tying just for the sake of the camera, but if you're tying these really tiny, 1 CDC feather is plenty. And this is just a natural gray. Any shade of gray will work. I don't really care for white. I think it's too bright. But I've got 2, in the case of this 18, just natural dun-colored CDC feathers. And I've got the tips separated there. And I'm going to tie those in just with a turn. And I'm going to pull them down to about a shank length long, like so. And I'll start to wrap back over them. And then I'll come in from the back and want to kind of lay those butt ends down and trim them at an angle so that I can continue down and build a nice smooth taper as I come down. So give you a little idea of what we got going on there so far. Very simple. Now for the body on this fly, I'm going to use a stripped and dyed peacock quill. And you can see on this quill, the bottom edge there is the dark edge. And whenever you wrap a peacock quill, it's going to have a dark edge. This is just like a biot. It's going to have a dark edge, and I want the dark edge to be tied in so that it's toward the back of the hook, so that it is the following edge, and that'll help create the segmented body that we're after. And you can see these are pre-stripped and dyed, so there's a little bit of hurl left on the very tip end. So I'm going to tie this in. I'm actually going to cut that off and tie this in on my near side of the hook here, and just come forward over that tip end. You don't want to go and tie it in right by the very tip, though you'll be tempted to do that. There's plenty of length here for midge size flies, so you don't have to worry about running out of quill. Hopefully that's not famous last words here as I get into this fly, but you don't need to tie it in by the very, very tip. It'll almost always break, and it just makes it much harder to work with. Now that dyed quill I had soaked. You can soak it in just warm water. You can stick one in your mouth as you tie and soak it that way. You just want to get it soaked a little bit so it's a little bit more pliable. And once I've got that tied in, I've built just a bit of a taper there. You can see how smooth that thread taper is. I want to try to keep that as smooth and even as possible. And I'll grab the butt end of the quill in my hackle pliers, and I'm going to begin to wrap forward. And make sure you miss your hook point here. You can see I'm just slightly overlapping these turns so that that dark edge becomes our rib as we come through. You can see it makes a beautifully ribbed body. And true to form, like I said, we didn't run out of quill before we got to the base of the wing there. So there's plenty of length. So don't feel like you've got to shortchange yourself. And I'll tie that off with a couple of turns and come in and trim that out. I'm just going to build a little bit of a thread head or thread thorax here, just to smooth that off. And I'll sweep the wing and the floral fiber up and bring the thread to the front for just a couple turns. And I'm going to get my little midge whip finisher here. If you don't have a Tiumco midge whip finisher like this, you should get one. It's much more efficient than everything else I've seen out there. The knot works the same way. It's just a more efficient little tool and is really well made. So there's my tool endorsement for this video. So after I've whip finished that, I'm going to come in, I'm going to trim this floral fiber just a little longer than the wing, just a bit. You can see that's maybe a quarter longer than the wing, just a bit proud of what the wing is. And then one last thing I like to do to these before I call them done is I want to coat over that body with some sort of resin. You can use regular head cement, and honestly, that'll be fine. The resin, UV resin, and I'm going to use Solarez Bone Dry Plus here. Let's see if I can get that on the screen there for you. Bone Dry Plus. I'm just going to take a little drop of this. It's not really going to take much. And I'm going to put that on the body, including that thread head, from head to tail, and coat all the way around the body. Make sure I get the bottom. Try not to get it in your hook eye if you could help it. This Bone Dry Plus is damn near water thin, so it's very easy to smooth out. You can see how that brightens up that body a bit. And I'll give that just a couple rotations because I fiddled around with it, kind of get that smoothed out. And then I'm going to hit it with my UV lamp from fairly far away as I rotate the fly. And what that'll do is allow the the resin to cure slowly rather than all at once. When you cure your resin all at once with a blast of light right up close to it, it cures very quickly and it doesn't seem to adhere near as well. So I want to hit that from far away, and you can see I'm kind of shining the light on and off of it, and that's just allowing it to cure a little bit more slowly. So once I've got that done, I'll put my cap back on my resin so I don't spill that. But that is our finished mole midge. You can see that that strip peacock body is very simple, but gosh, it sure comes out pretty, doesn't it? That's a crimson colored quill. I do these in olive and natural, and yeah, you can just use a dyed black or just even plain black thread quill. You know, any variety of body styles for this, but that peacock quill is pretty tough to beat for realism. Purple's a good one too. Super simple little fly. Even Lance Egan can tie this one, I'm pretty sure. I've not seen him tie this, but this is really pretty similar to all the stuff he does tie. But you know, I think now with the video, I don't think I'll have any problem with it at all. So thanks for watching. That was the mole midge on the Charlie Craven Show. Take care. We'll see you next time around.
All right, as you heard there, the man himself getting digs in on me. He's saying I probably couldn't tie. Actually, in fairness, he did say he thought I could tie it. I think I could too. Thanks for showing me how, Charlie. You're always leading the way. I appreciate that. All right, so all joking aside, that was an awesome little midge from the man, Charlie Craven. Designed to sit kind of half in the film and sticking just out. So a very, very good fly for very picky fish on tailwaters, which is what we're talking about. So killer fly from Mr. Charlie Craven. I don't think we had a lot more questions come in. So I think we're just about ready to wrap up. So before we do though, tune in next week if you're watching this live anyway. If you're watching on YouTube a year from now, disregard this. But next Thursday, January 13th, the topic is saltwater flies, and we have Dave Chenard on tap. So tune into that one if you're a saltwater angler, or if you just want to watch somebody demonstrate, or a few people demonstrate some cool saltwater patterns. Also of note, these fly tying videos will all be posted on YouTube. So this whole live stream will be on there, and I believe they also have the individual fly videos too. So if you don't want to watch the whole thing, you could go back and just reference one of these flies. Otherwise, don't forget to like and subscribe to the Umpqua channel. That will get you updated to when there are any, they'll send you an email anytime there's a new video. If you haven't already, follow Umpqua on Instagram at Umpqua Feather Merchants. And if you don't mind, give me a follow as well at Lance Egan Fly Fishing. Before we close too, I want to throw a shout out to TU again for their support and helping get these promote and getting these tying sessions underway. So thank you, Trout Unlimited. If you're not a Trout Unlimited member, I encourage you to do that as well. Join that great conservation group. Otherwise, I think we're out of questions. We're out of time. We've tied all of our flies. We've chatted about tailwater techniques, so we're going to sign off. So on behalf of all the fly tyers, I'd like to thank Umpqua, and I'd like to thank all of you viewers for your awesome questions and for tuning in. I wish you a great fishy year, and I hope you have some happy angling ahead of you. So have a good time. Go tie a few flies and catch a fish.